Uh, Good morning. Hi, and welcome to this module on collecting data to extract insights. In this module, we'll discuss the different sources that you can use to access data, and we'll then study a number of data preparation techniques. We'll discuss techniques such as standardization and normalization that can be used to pre-process numeric features of our data. We'll also discuss how we can use binning and sampling to get a representative sample of our dataset. Then we'll move on to discussing and the processing techniques that you would use to work with big data that may not sit in memory or a single database. Then we'll discuss different kinds of data that you might have to deal with, like batch data or streaming and real-time data. Now, when you're working with streaming data, time is significant. And so we'll also discuss the concept of event time and processing time. So to begin with, a data professional helps make business decisions based on data. And we discussed earlier the two hats of a data professional. The first is to find the dots, identify important elements in a data set. So this involves a careful data collection and applying techniques to deal with missing data, outlier data, and some other problems. The next step is to connect the dots, explain these elements that we've identified in our data via relationships with other elements. There are actually three important steps involved in connecting the dots, but we'll discuss on two of these steps, namely processing data for use in models and incorporating real-world data into models. So these are the more practical steps. So what is standardization? When you're working with data, standardization is a common pre-processing technique that you'll use with numeric features. So let's consider your data set represented in a tabular format as shown. There are key features of columns in your data, and there are a total of n records represented by xn1 up to xnk. So your data could be represented using this matrix. If you explore the numeric values in your dataset, you'll find that different features will have different means, different ranges, and different standard deviation. So it's hard to find for you, to compare these features. When you pre-process your data using standardization, however, this helps build more robust machine learning models. So standardization involves first calculating the average of each column of data, and then for each column, for each of these columns rather, you'll calculate the standard deviation of that data. So you have averages x1 to xk and standard deviations x1 through xk as well. And so when you standardize your data, from every value in your data set, you'll subtract the average of that column and divide by the standard deviation. Once you've performed this mathematical operation, each column of the standardized data now will have a mean or an average of 0 and a variance of a standard or a standard deviation of 1. As you can see, standardization involves expressing all of your data in the form of z-scores, or in terms of how many standard deviations are they away from the mean. Standardization is a column-wise or feature-wise operation. It operates column by column and yields features with zero mean and unit variance. So the features of your original data was distributed like the visualization you see on the left. And as you can see, the means are different and the standard deviations are different. But after you've standardized your data, all of the means will be the same, equal to 0, and data will be expressed in terms of its standard deviation. Um, this technique that we just discussed involves the use of the mean and the standard deviation. Mean, as you know, is a measure of central tendency, and standard deviation is a measure of dispersion. The mean value of a data set tends to be very sensitive to the presence of outlier data, which is why if you want a more robust way to standardize your data, you'd use robust standardization. This is an alternative measure of central tendency that is robust in the presence of outliers. Is the median and the interquartile range is also a measure of dispersion. Robust standardization now involves subtracting the median of your data from every value, xi to xn, and dividing by the interquartile range. This technique is called robust standardization because the output does not change much due to the presence of outliers. The objective of both of these techniques is exactly the same, which is to represent all of your numeric features such that they're comparable and use this pre-processed data to build more robust ML models. So again, if your original data can be expressed using a visualization such as the one you see on the left, where you can see that the range of the data is very different and there are outliers. After robust standardization, you'll get data that is distributed like you see on the right. Again, the median of all of your features after robust standardization will be equal to 0. And this is what we would like to achieve. Now let's go to normalization. This is actually another common data preparation technique that you'll use with numeric data. We'll study that here in this clip. Every record in your dataset will be made up of a number of different fields. Now, it can be one field or many. So every record can be thought of as an input vector. We'll discuss this later. Normalization is the process now of scaling these input vectors individually to unit norm or unit magnitude. Normalization is commonly applied to data that you feed into an ML model. So again, um, to give you the emphasis on why we are discussing this, these are all prerequisites before we go to machine learning model. Okay, um, let's talk about cosine similarity. Often in machine learning techniques, you need to know how similar two data points are. How similar those vectors are. And cosine similarity is also a measure, can be thought of as a measure of similarity because two non-zero of two non-zero vectors. This is widely used in, again, machine learning algorithms, especially in documenting modeling applications. So let's understand intuitively how cosine similarity works. Um, First, let's consider two orthogonal vectors. Uh, what is a vector? Do you know what a vector is? It's actually a value with a number and a direction. This is in contrast with scalar values, where you only have values. So in this representation, we have vectors A and B represented, and are 90 degrees to one another. Orthogonal vectors represent, in terms of data, uncorrelated data. So A and B are unrelated very much or independent. The cosine similarity then of orthogonal vectors is of course 90 degrees, which is equal to cosine of 90, 0. And again, you know that a cosine similarity of 0 means that A and B are unrelated. Now let's consider two vectors that are aligned. Vectors A and B are now represented in this diagram, parallel to one another, and thus guess. The angle between them is exactly equal to 0 degrees. Now these vectors can be considered to be perfectly aligned, and the data points A and B have a correlation of 1, the highest possible correlation that can exist. So you can think of the cosine of 0 degrees, and you know that it's equal to 1. Cosine of 0 is 1. Now, lastly, let's consider opposite vectors. Here, vectors A and B are opposite in directions. So the angle between these vectors is 180 degrees. Such vectors are said to be perfectly opposed. And the correlation between these two vectors is thus equal to -1. And this is the lowest possible value. Now, if you calculate the cosine of the angle between these two vectors, the cosine of 180 degrees is equal to -1. So, in summary, it's clear that the cosine similarity is a quick and intuitive way to express the alignment that exists between two vectors to see how similar two vectors are. Each vector here can be thought as representing a single point in our data. Okay? So, so that you will again be aligned while we are discussing vectors. So, now, on a higher level, what if you have three dimensions? A point can be represented now using coordinates x, y, and z. So now we understand, and I hope you now understand why cosine similarity is useful. Again, this is in relevance to machine learning. Because ML algorithms use cosine similarity very much to calculate similarity between vectors. Now, you may ask, how does normalization fit in all of this. Um, Here's how. So if the angle between two vectors is represented by theta, the cosine similarity between these vectors, that is cosine of theta, is given by this formula you see here on the screen. In the numerator, we have the dot product of the two vectors a dot b. And in the denominator, we have the magnitude of a multiplied by the magnitude of b, I mean. The formula for the square of the magnitude of vectors is, as you can see here on the screen, we have magnitude of a squared and b squared. And if you look at this mathematical formula, you know that calculating the cosine similarity would be reduced to the simple dot product a and b if the magnitude of each vector were equal to 1. And this is exactly what normalization does. We pre-convert the vectors a and b to unit norm vectors to simplify cosine similarity calculations. And unit norm vectors are obtained when you divide the vector a by its magnitude using the formula that you see here on screen, and the vector b by its magnitude using the same formula. When you pre-convert a and b to unit norm vectors, calculating the cosine similarity becomes very straightforward, and this greatly improves, again, the performance of your ML models. Now, one thing to note about normalization. Normalizing is a row-wise operations. It applies to a vector, one vector at a time. Whereas scaling and standardization that we saw earlier is a column-wise operation. So yeah, normalization is a general technique of converting a vector to unit norm. There are three different norms defined for vectors. The L1 norm, where the sum of the absolute values of the components of the vector is equal to 1. We also have the L2 norm, which is the traditional definition of vector magnitude that we just saw earlier. L2 norm is where the square root of the sum of the squares of the vector coordinates is equal to 1. There's also a third kind of norm that can be used, which is the max norm. This is where the largest absolute value of the elements of a vector is set to 1, and other elements are exposed in terms of this largest value. Now let's go to binning or data binarization. Um, when you're preparing and processing data, we're still in this subject. It's possible that certain numeric features may be in the form of a continuous variable, right? This is more realistic. You might want to convert this to categorical form before processing. And that's exactly what binning does. So, data binarization is a specific binning technique. This converts a continuous variable, which can take on any numeric value within the range, into a binary categorical variable. Categorical data refers to data which has discrete values. Binary categorical data can have any of two values, actually. And continuous data can be binarized based on a threshold, which is specified by us, the user. So, okay, let's visualize how binarizing data works. So let's say you have continuous data that can be represented in two dimensions. You'll draw a line through this data, which represents the threshold, this vertical line on the left. I mean, vertical dashed line. And this threshold can be thought of as dividing line for your data. Now, all of the points which lie above the or to the right of this threshold can have one value. Let's say it's 1. Points that lie to the left of the threshold will have another value. Let's say it's 0. Now, the objective of binarizing data is to convert continuous input to a binary categorical output. Okay, binary meaning it only has a value of 0 and 1. Now, what if you want to divide your data into more than 2 categories? This brings us to a more general concept, discretizing data. This generalizes the idea of binarization and converts continuous data into categorical data arranged into a specific number of bins. And the number of bins can be 2 or more. So let's understand this concept again with a visualization. Let's say your continuous data looks something like this on the left. A continuous string of data is fed as the input, and after you discretize, you might have 3 so-called bins. Discretization then is a process that the original continuous data is now converted to discrete categories, and the output categories can be 2 or more. Okay, going further, actually we have several different techniques or strategies that you can use to bin or binning your data. Let's consider just 3 of these. The first is uniform binning, where the bin widths are constant in each feature. Say the numeric values of your feature range from 1 to 100, for example. And you've chosen a bin width of 10. So you can convert your continuous data to 10 discrete values corresponding to your bins, meaning uh, the first bin would have a value of 1 to 10, the second bin 11 to 20, the third bin 21 to 30, so on and so forth. Now you can also choose to bin your continuous data using quantiles. Here is where all bins in each feature will have approximately the same number of samples or data points. There's also a third strategy um, in which you can choose to apply some kind of clustering technique to your data and bin your data based on the centroids of a k-means clustering procedures. So this means that the points that are close to one another, meaning latency, will belong to the same bin and will have the same discrete output. So much for that. Now let's now go to transactional and analytical processing. So data that we have to work with and process nowadays is actually big data. Data that is in gigabytes, terabytes, or have you heard of petabytes in size? We had spoken earlier actually about the essential steps in connecting the dots to analyze data. And we need to process data for use in models, ML models, and incorporate real world data into models. We also dove briefly into data processing techniques earlier. We'll now look about incorporating real world data into models. And we know that data in the real world tends to be big, uh, just like what you sent me a month ago. So when you work with data, there are two kinds of processing operations that you can perform. One is transactional and another is analytical processing. So let's consider two hypothetical persons. One who is working with management support. He is responsible for tracking and delivering orders on time. So in your case, this could be the meter readers or the automation that your digital meters does in real time, supplying you with streaming data. And on the other hand, we have an analyst. So, well, she would be, in this example, she would be responsible for tracking and monitoring revenues. But in your case, this would be your analytical team, the one who's, or an app, your app, who is gathering all of this real-time data into one single repository or database. And we will discuss database on a later slide. Now, here is where the differences lie in how we process data in this case. Uh, John will perform what we call transactional processing of data, and Anna will do or require analytical processing. So let's compare. Um, Transactional processing actually involves ensuring the correctness of individual entries in the data. Okay, they're more on quality, real time. Whereas analytical processing involves analyzing large data in batches. For transactional processing, recent data is more important and significant. Access to recent data from the last few hours or even minutes is needed. In contrast, analytical processing involves accessing very large amounts of data, spanning months or even years. Transactional processing typically involves updates of the data in, yeah, as I said, real time, whereas analytical processing mostly involves reading the data to extract what we call insights. Transactional processing systems need to enable fast real-time access to data, whereas analytical processing systems need to be able to handle long-running jobs. Now, typically, for transactional processing, all of the data is available from a single source. In contrast, for analytical processing, to extract insights, you might require multiple data sources. Now, back in those days, in our days, early 2000s, both of these transactional and analytical processing objectives could actually be achieved using the same physical database system because data wasn't very large then. It could fit on a single machine, even with backup. And data tends to be structured and well defined. And it's important that you be able to access individual records in your data. There was no replication and updated data was available immediately. But as the size and scale of data has grown, it's very hard to meet all of the requirements for transactional as well as analytical systems using the same database system. Now let's delve more on what big data is. And why is it called big data anyway? Big data is so named because it's huge. Okay, that's I guess that's obvious. Data does not fit on a single machine or system. It has to be distributed on a cluster with multiple machines. Big data need not always be structured or well defined. It can be semi-structured or unstructured data. Typically, when you're working with big data, you don't need random access to data. You simply need to be able to process a huge amount of data to extract insights. Big data is typically used for read operations and data is replicated, which means that propagation of updates takes time as updates have to be propagated to all replicas. Now, when you're working with very large data, you're likely to have multiple sources from where you ingest data. Okay, in your case, I believe this is also in your case. And as such, different sources may have different unknown formats. So now that we've understood the requirements for transactional and analytical processing, let's now consider the tools that we would use for this. So for transactional processing, it is typically performed using our traditional relational RDBMS. This is typically an SQL database hosted on on-premise and more much more popular now on a cloud platform such as AWS or Google or Azure. Analytical processing, on the other hand, is performed using large data warehouses. Now, let's just to give you additionally knowledge on big data. Um, let's talk about the characteristics. Now, we have the so-called three V's of big data. The three V's represent specific attributes that define big data. The first of these V's refer to volume. This is the amount of data that has to be ingested and processed by your system. Volume, as you might imagine, is the main characteristic that makes data big. Data is no longer measured in megabytes, as I mentioned earlier. It is now measured in gigabytes, terabytes, or petabytes, and perhaps some systems are now in hundreds of petabytes. The second V is the characteristics of big data that we refer to is variety. Data is not just structured data that can be stored in a relational database. It involves unstructured data such as tweets, text, images, videos. All of this can be ingested and processed using big data technologies that we have nowadays. The variety refers to the sheer number and type of sources available out there. And finally, the third V that characterizes big data is velocity. Velocity refers to how fast data comes in that needs to be processed. Batch data is data that you have stored on disk somewhere. Streaming data is real-time data that's constantly coming in and needs to be processed. Now, it's pretty obvious that you need to scale to meet the needs of big data. And there are two types of scaling possible, the vertical and the horizontal. As the date, as the size and scale of the data that you're working with grows, vertical scaling involves making your processing machine more powerful. You continue working with data on a single server, but you make that server more powerful with more memory, more CPU, and more disk space. Vertical scaling, of course, has its physical limits. There's a limit to how powerful a single machine can be. Now, horizontal scaling, on the other hand, as data size grows, this is where, as size grows, you add more servers. A single server by itself may not be very powerful. It may even be made of off-the-shelf components. However, all of these servers together can process huge amounts of data. And horizontal scaling using a cluster of machine is what the real world is moving towards. Some more comparison. Vertical scaling involves the use of monolithic architecture. Horizontal scaling uses a distributed architecture where we work on a cluster of machines. Vertical scaled systems do not require orchestration. All of the data is stored on a single machine. Whereas when you work with horizontally scaled systems, you need to have orchestration software that distributes the data and the processing. Vertical scaling does not require you to shard data and spread them across machines, whereas horizontal scaling does. With vertical scaling, you might back up data, but your data is not replicated in real time. Whereas with horizontal scaling, in order to keep your data secure, it needs to be replicated. More comparison, with vertical scaling, since all your data is stored on a single machine, it's easier to ensure the consistency of your data. Whenever you perform read operations, all of the updates that have gone before it will be reflected in your data. For horizontal scaling, on the other hand, uh, with replication, it's hard to ensure consistency. Vertical scale systems can offer strong consistency fairly easily, whereas horizontal scaled systems often only eventual consistency. We'll talk about this in just a bit. Usually, vertical scaled systems offer transactional support, such as atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability, or in short, ACID. With horizontal scaling, ACID is hard to provide. Vertical scaled systems are typically used for transactional processing or OLTP, whereas horizontal scaled systems are used in OLAP applications for big data. Now, OLAP stands for Online Analytical Processing. Um, to round up this session, before we conclude, now let's talk about strong consistency and eventual consistency. Okay, in this diagram, you can see that vertical scale systems which have a single powerful machine can perform strong consistency guarantees actually. Whereas horizontal scale systems only provide eventual consistency guarantees. So what does this mean? Let me expound. So let's consider a single server that you see on the left. You receive an update request for your data, and data is immediately updated on that server, and the request is returned to the user. Data needs to be updated in exactly one place. All other requests for that data will receive the latest updates. So this is strong. This is what I meant by strong consistency. Now on the right, let's have a distributed system. Horizontally scaled one with multiple servers. You receive an update request for your data. The master node of the data will be updated, but this update might be propagated to replicas later on. and it won't be immediately replicated. The request will return first. The replica will be updated later. Now, before the replica updates, if a request for this data is received on the replica, you might receive stale contents in the response. So this is what I meant by eventual consistency. It's not immediate. Now, the next subject will be discussed on a separate session. And this is regarding batch and streaming data. So I hope you enjoyed this session and looking forward to my next video. Thank you for watching.